What's up, my podcast friends? How are you doing? Did you start a new semester? How has your week been? Do you feel like you are settling in? Have you found a routine that works for you? Sometimes the adjustment can take a little bit, so just be patient. Take it one step at a time and give yourself grace during this period of transition. And remember, it's completely normal if you feel a little off kilter. It will all fall into place. Trust me, trust yourself, trust the process. I will tell you a little bit about my week before we get into this week's episode, or rather this week's topic. This is the episode. So I've had a pretty wild week. I don't know if you heard last week's episode, but that's where I announced that I was going to be launching a project on YouTube. So I've done that, which is kind of a big step for me, to be honest. I did not plan to put myself out there in that way. Honestly, launching a podcast was a big enough deal for me. But you know what? Sometimes I get these nudges and I don't know. I just have to listen to them. And sometimes I think the way I operate best is to sort of just dive into a project when I've got the momentum. So that's what I'm doing. And it's been interesting. Like I said, it's kind of an experiment, recording myself every day, putting myself out there in new ways. But I'm thinking of it as just part of the playground of life, if that makes sense. I don't know. I like to keep things light. I like to not take myself too seriously. And when I think about life as a playground, then I'm just out there playing, seeing what happens. Nothing too serious going on. So anyway, check it out if you haven't already. It's called the Joy in the Journey Challenge. And I'm recording daily check-in videos to cheer you along, to hold myself accountable, to help you hold yourself accountable on any project or goal that you're working on in this fall season. So we're going to run this for the next 12 weeks, basically the fall semester up until Thanksgiving. And if you're not on the academic calendar, and if you're not in the US and those things don't mean anything to you, then the next 12 weeks, so up until I think the last week in November is when I'm going to be doing this. So come along, join me on YouTube. The channel is called Life Between Classes, and I have a playlist for all of the daily check-in videos. And I'm tracking my progress on my project this semester, which is reviving my art practice. So I hope you'll join me. But I am focusing on something different for the podcast episode this week. So I'm going to keep running the podcast as per usual. I'm a little bit behind recording this one, but better late than never. Honestly, I'm not really holding myself to a really strict schedule because this is for fun, and that makes it feel a little too forced, a little too serious. So anyway, here I am, and today I'm excited to talk to you about a book that has made a pretty big impact in my life. It is The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz, and it's called A Practical Guide to Personal Freedom. It's of the Toltec tradition. It's called a Toltec wisdom book. And I read it a couple years ago. It's a short book. You can see if you're watching the video of this recording of this episode, it's only like 140 pages, but pretty big print. And I listened to it in one go. I listened as an audiobook on a drive to Florida a couple years ago. And like I said, it just had a big impact on me. I was probably at a point in time when I was just receptive to the messages in this book. So I've used this in a discussion group with students, something called a cadre that I've run twice, last fall semester and last spring semester at the university where I was teaching. And there was pretty good feedback from the students who participated in that as well. So I thought it'd be fun to share on the podcast. So even if you were with me in those discussion groups, you're familiar with this book, you've probably read it already, but it's one of those books that I feel like we can dip back in every so often and kind of remind ourselves of some of the lessons, and even maybe get new perspective on some of the content in here, just based on sort of where we are in our life at the time that we revisit it. So I find that to be true with a lot of the books that have meant something for me in my life. Excuse me. So today we're going to talk about the first chapter, sort of the premise of the whole book. And like I said, it's in the Toltec spiritual tradition. So let me just read to you a little passage that explains that. So it says, Toltec knowledge arises from the same essential unity of truth as all the sacred esoteric traditions found around the world. Though it is not a religion, it honors all the spiritual masters who have taught on the earth. While it does embrace spirit, it is most accurately described as a way of life, distinguished by the ready accessibility of happiness and love. What's not to love about that? So not necessarily a religious book, but it does come from that Native American Toltec tradition. Okay, so I'll just quickly summarize the introduction. There is a story here in the introduction, the first couple pages, that's called The Smoky Mirror. And there's a lot of symbolism in it, but let me just pull up my notes. Actually, I'm gonna get those on my screen here. Bear with me just a moment. So, okay, so The Smoky Mirror is a story about a Toltec man who has an experience that sort of causes him to awaken from the dream of life and see reality with clear vision. So in other words, this describes a spiritual awakening, and it causes him to be fully awake, fully aware, and to recognize the fog or the smoke that was previously clouding his vision of reality. Okay, so that's the introductory story. So then it dives into chapter 1, is called Domestication and the Dream of the Planet. So it starts off by explaining, and I'm going to summarize the main points. Okay, I'm not going to get too deep into this, but just kind of grabbing the main points, offering them for you to think about, to consider, and to think about how these might relate to your life. So one of the first points he makes in this chapter is this idea that we as humans create our experience of life through how we perceive reality. And this is what he calls the personal dream. So each human creates their experience, creates their personal dream, and then kind of these all contribute to what he calls the dream of the planet, or the collective reality that we share and that we all experience together. And he also explains that our dream, quote unquote, or our experience of reality, is directed by what we give our attention to. So he talks about how humans are sort of programmed, like how our brains are programmed from childhood. And he calls this process domestication, which I realize sounds kind of crude and animalistic, but these are all ideas. You don't have to accept them. We're just going to entertain them, and I'm kind of just summarizing them here. So he says that we begin to form this so-called dream, or again, our experience of life, when we're children, and it's heavily influenced by the dream of our parents or whoever raises us as children. And it's also how our belief system is formed. So this book is called The Four Agreements. So let's define what is an agreement. He says that an agreement is information that we accept as truth and is therefore incorporated into our belief system, which he calls the book of law. And I'm paraphrasing here. I'll let you know when I'm directly quoting anything from the book. But anyway, did you catch that? So an agreement is information that we accept as truth and that is then held onto and incorporated into our belief system. And his term for that is the book of law. He says that if we don't believe something, if we're given information that we don't believe, that we don't accept, then we don't agree to it, and therefore it doesn't get stored in our belief system. It doesn't get incorporated into our book of law. He points out that as children, we don't know any better than to trust what is fed to us by our parents, by our community, by the media, by basically anything that we're exposed to. During our childhood, our brains are very impressionable, and without knowing any better, we tend to accept whatever is given to us as truth. Right? So he also says that we as children are heavily influenced or programmed by a system of reward and punishment. And this reward and punishment can take many different forms. Okay, so this doesn't just refer to reward in the form of, something tangible, like a material prize or reward. It doesn't just refer to punishment in the form of, scolding or anything like that. It could be, the reward could be in the form of attention from our parents, attention from our teachers or our siblings. So he says that this system can influence us to become someone we are not, just in order to gain approval from others. So that's sort of the caveat that I think he really wants to bring to light in this chapter, is that we sort of come into the world with these like innate ways of being, for lack of better terminology there. And then we are molded and shaped by those people of influence around us and by this system of reward and punishment that may or may not kind of correspond with our nature. So here's an example of this. If someone as a child gets rewarded, and I'm doing air quotes here because again, the reward may not be in like the tangible sense, but if a child gets rewarded through attention by sort of playing dumb, acting out, being silly, even if that's not truly who they are, if they gain attention from that kind of behavior and that kind of persona, then that child is motivated to continue doing those things because the attention is kind of like a reward. So that child can develop a social mask or this persona of being, the class clown, for example. Does that make sense? So he also points out that much of our behavior as children is fear-based. He says that we're driven by a fear of being rejected, a fear of not being good enough, a fear of, not being given that reward of attention from our parents or our teachers or our siblings or our friends. So we may train ourselves, again, to be someone we are not, to act in a way that's not natural to us in order to be accepted. So this is where we begin to lose what he calls our personal freedom. We begin to lose our natural sense of self because we feel that we're not allowed to be ourselves. We're not free to be ourselves when society is rewarding us for behaviors that are not necessarily in accordance with who we really are. Okay, so I'm going to pause right there. And let's take a moment for a little bit of reflection. So since he's talking about this idea of acting in ways that might not be true to who we really are, and using social masks as a way to be accepted by others, I want to ask you, can you think of a time or maybe a certain situation in your life where you have worn a social mask in order to be accepted by others? Or maybe you wore a social mask, you presented yourself with a certain, persona, for fear of being unfavorably judged by someone. Kind of the same thing, I guess. But think about that for a minute. Can you think of a time? Or maybe it's a certain social context where you do this repeatedly. So I'll tell you mine, a couple things that come up for me. And if you've been listening to the podcast, the first one won't surprise you because I've talked about this before. But earlier on in my career as a Spanish instructor, I had this idea of how a professor should behave, how a professor should present themselves, and, just this personality. So I kind of forced myself, or like wore this persona that wasn't really true for me. And I tried to be like this really serious, sort of strict, demanding professor. And I pretty quickly realized that was a false persona. That was a mask that I was trying on for fear of, I guess, for fear that my students wouldn't respect me if I just presented myself as I am, which is generally a little bit less serious. I like to joke around. I like to keep things light. I like to have fun in class. Like, that's really important to me. I realize that now, many years later. But in the beginning, I think I was not as secure in myself and my ability of being a professor. So I felt like I needed to, put on the show that I was like tough and strict and serious, because if I didn't, then they wouldn't take me seriously, So that's an example from my life. And I can even probably say that I wore social masks at times in college. Like, I don't know, when I felt sort of pressured to like go along with my friends and go out to a party and get wasted, like that was part of the college experience that I was surrounded by. And it wasn't something that I was particularly into myself. A lot of times I would prefer to spend the evening in the studio working on an art project, or, just lay low and watch a movie. But because of who I was, sort of not who, but really the culture that I was surrounded by at my university, I think I, at times, gave into that, wore that social mask, like, yeah, this is what I want to do, even if it really wasn't. So those are two examples from my life. So think about that for you. And then let's keep going a little bit more in this chapter. Another one of the major points that he makes, in addition to sort of talking about how we're programmed, and how we can lose our personal freedom due to the things that we're told and that we see around us, he also points out that every person has sort of these two voices in their brain. There's the voice of the judge and the voice of the victim. And the judge, I mean, these are pretty straightforward. The judge is like that inner critic. It's the thing that judges everything around us, including ourselves, and can often be pretty harsh and pretty negative. And I kind of want to read a little passage about this. So, yeah. So he says, this is on page 9 in my book, there is something in our minds that judges everybody and everything, including the weather, the dog, the cat, everything. The inner judge uses what is in our book of law to judge everything we do and don't do, everything we think and don't think, and everything we feel and don't feel. Everything lives under the tyranny of this judge. Is it tyranny or tyranny? Tyranny. It's one of those words that I read and I don't really think about how it's pronounced, and I guess I don't say that word out loud very much. Language, fun. So anyway, every time we do something that goes against the book of law, the judge says we are guilty. We need to be punished. We should be ashamed. So that's his description of the judge. And then he goes on to say, there's another part of us that receives the judgments, and this part is called the victim. The victim carries the blame, the guilt, and the shame. It is the part of us that says, poor me, I'm not good enough. I'm not intelligent enough. I'm not attractive enough. I'm not worthy of love. Poor me. So he kind of explains this kind of interplay between the two. And then the judge agrees and says, yes, you are not good enough. And this is all, and it's sort of a back and forth in our brain. So I want to ask you, what does the judge sound like in your brain? What does the victim sound like? I have, throughout my life, had a very strong judge in my brain. I'm sure you can relate. It's a voice that I've learned to give less attention to over the years, but the judge in my brain often talks about my performance. For example, at the end of teaching a class, I'll think, oh man, I could have done that so much better. This didn't go well. That didn't go as planned. That was a stupid idea, right? So I'll kind of evaluate or reevaluate what I've done, and the judge speaks up and criticizes my work. I hear the judge in other areas of my life too, around, I don't know, things like, oh, I could have gotten more done today. I wasn't productive enough. I didn't organize my time well. So sometimes the judge can maybe be helpful, but it's something that we need to be aware of. We need to keep in check because it can also be pretty harmful. So what does the judge sound like in your brain? What does the victim sound like? Where do you hear yourself saying, oh, poor me, if only I were more intelligent or better at my sport, or if only I'd had a better upbringing or more opportunities, or whatever that looks like for you. Notice it. Okay. A lot of what he encourages here is to bring awareness to what's going on up here. By that, I mean in our brain. I just pointed to my forehead. Okay. What else? So the judge and the victim. And okay, I read that quote. So going back to this idea of the book of law, he asks, like, what if some of the agreements in our book of law are false? So maybe you were told as a child that you're not good at singing. What if that's actually not true? What if you heard one critical comment from someone who you respected, and you took that and agreed to it, and unknowingly that became incorporated into your book of law, your book of truth, and created part of the image that you have of yourself. Maybe you were taught that, I don't know, women can't raise children and have a career. What if that's false? Maybe you were taught that only certain professions are acceptable to pursue. What if that's just a story that you were told? So a lot of the beliefs in our book of law may not even be conscious. Meaning they may not even, we may not be aware of most of our agreements or our beliefs in our book of law, right? We may just assume that they're true because we don't know any better. So how could we even imagine it to be otherwise? That's the crazy thing about all this, is like, it's difficult to even be aware of our beliefs unless we start to really intentionally think about them, or until we encounter someone who doesn't hold that same agreement, or maybe we encounter a situation that challenges that agreement. And until that happens, we're just going to keep believing it unconsciously. And that agreement will be part of what creates our reality, what creates our personal dream. So that had me thinking about, and you know me, I feel like every episode I reference a movie, and lately it's been children's movies or Marvel movies. But that brought to mind, once again, the movie Trolls. And I was thinking about how the Bergens held a false belief. They had sort of in their book of law, if you will, the belief that the only way to experience happiness was to eat a troll. So this belief was then like passed down through the generations. And they even, as a society, like as a community, they created a whole holiday around celebrating this belief. What is it called in the movie? I can't think of it right now, like Trollstice or something. Right? So anyway, this whole system was formed around this belief that eating a troll is the only way to experience happiness, until, and they were all on board with that until, and again, spoiler alert, so if you haven't seen the movie, maybe you fast forward a little bit. But then the troll Princess Poppy comes along, and she shows them that this isn't true. This isn't true at all. And there are other ways of feeling happiness and contentment in life, and that they can all do that without consuming anything outside of themselves. And I talk about that in a previous episode. So anyway, not going to go any further, but I thought that was a really kind of perfect example of how, our belief systems could be based on false truths. That's an oxymoron. False beliefs. We'll go with that. So anyway, Don Miguel Ruiz, the author, invites us to examine and question our agreements, our beliefs, and consider adopting 4 new agreements, which he proposes in this book, that they will pave the path to personal freedom. So that's a summary of this first chapter that's called Domestication and the Dream of the Planet. A couple other concepts I want to mention from this chapter is he talks about this idea of a fog that obscures the truth. And this goes back to the story that I mentioned, the smoky mirror that's in the introduction. But basically the idea is that we can't see the truth because we're kind of, our vision is clouded by this fog or this smoke. And there is one line that sort of sums this up. I guess it doesn't sum it up, but anyway, I just wanted to share this quote with you. He says, "We cannot see who we truly are. We cannot see that we are not free." So if kind of accepting the truth is the path to freedom, recognizing the truth is the path to freedom and being who we truly are, then until we see who we truly are, we can't be free. Okay, another thing he talks about in this chapter that's worth mentioning is how our actions and our beliefs can be driven by fear, and that this is very common in human society. And he even goes so far as to state, and I quote, "Just being ourselves is the biggest fear of humans." So anyway, that's just kind of pointing out the significance of fear in our life and how we may be driven to hide our true self out of fear. So that's really powerful to me. And if you've listened to other episodes, you know that it's really important to me to feel like I can be my true self, to express my authentic self. And I don't know, I think that's something that does open the door to greater freedom. And then the last quote I want to share with you is about this idea of perfection. He explains that through the system of domestication, we sort of create this image of perfection that is, of course, it's a lie. It doesn't exist. I mean, it's not like this idea of perfection, it can never actually be achieved. But yet we tend to hold ourselves to it and judge everything kind of in comparison to our image of perfection. But this is what he says about it. Our image of perfection is why we don't accept ourselves and why we don't accept others the way they are. So, a little visit from Zizou here. Sorry, buddy. Hang out down there just for a minute. Okay. So that just about wraps it up. And I'll let that settle in your brain. And over the next week, or however long it is before you listen to the next episode, let's just sort of take a look at our life, take a peek into our own brain, and practice being the observer. So what does that mean? Being the observer of yourself and of your mind. Might sound kind of weird, but what I'm saying is let's be curious about why we do the things we do. Let's take note of the judgments and the beliefs that we hold about ourselves and about the world. And let's begin to ask ourselves, where in our life or in our mind might there be some fog that's obscuring the truth? Let's take note of whether our thoughts and actions are driven by love or by fear. And let's see if we can uncover some of the perhaps more hidden agreements that we hold, particularly the ones that we hold about ourselves. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you for joining me for this chat, and I invite you to come back and join me again next week, where we'll talk about the first of the 4 agreements. Take care, have a great weekend, and I will talk to you again very soon.